What if I told you that one of the most pivotal moments in King David's rise to power wasn't decided by his sword, his armies, or even his divine anointing, but by a woman whose name most people have never heard? What if the future of Israel's greatest king hung in the balance, and it was saved not by a prophet, not by a priest, not by a warrior, but by someone the Bible describes as both intelligent and beautiful, yet who lived in the shadow of one of Scripture's most despicable men? Her name was Abigail, and her story is about to shatter everything you thought you knew about heroism, wisdom, and divine intervention. This isn't just another Bible story about a brave woman. This is the account of how one person's courage prevented a massacre, changed the heart of a future king, and altered the entire course of Israel's history. And here's what's shocking. Most believers have never heard the full truth of what really happened. You see, Abigail's story takes place during one of the most dangerous periods in David's life. He's been anointed as Israel's future king, but he's living as a fugitive, hunted by a jealous King Saul with 600 armed men following him through the wilderness. These aren't peaceful times. This is survival. This is desperation. And in this chaos, David is about to make a decision that could have destroyed his entire destiny as the man after God's own heart. But before we dive into the crisis that nearly derailed everything, we need to understand who Abigail really was. Because this woman wasn't just in the right place at the right time. She was strategically positioned by God Himself for a moment that would echo through eternity. Her wisdom wasn't accidental. Her courage wasn't coincidental. And her influence on David's character and Israel's future was absolutely essential. If you're ready to discover how one woman's faithfulness in an impossible marriage led to her becoming the wife of a king, if you want to learn what real biblical wisdom looks like when everything is falling apart, and if you're curious about how God uses the most unexpected people to accomplish His greatest purposes, then you need to hear this story. Comment why if you're ready to uncover the shocking truth about David's unsung heroine. The story begins in the wilderness of Paran, a harsh and unforgiving landscape near the Sinai Peninsula where survival depended entirely on cooperation and mutual protection. This wasn't the green pastures and still waters of the 23rd Psalm. This was a place where rocks cut feet, where water was scarce, and where the wrong decision could mean death for hundreds of people. It was here, in this desolate region, that we encounter a wealthy man named Nabal who lived in the town of Maon. Now, before we even meet his wife Abigail, you need to understand something crucial about this man. His name literally meant fool in Hebrew. Think about that for a moment. Either his parents had remarkable foresight about his character, or this was a nickname that stuck because of his behavior. The Bible describes him as surly and mean in his dealings, but his foolishness went far deeper than just a bad attitude. Nabal was incredibly wealthy. He owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, making him one of the richest men in the region. His flocks were vast, his influence was significant, and his resources were abundant. But here's what made him dangerous. His wealth had made him proud, selfish, and completely disconnected from the social obligations that governed survival in the wilderness. He had forgotten that, in a lawless land, prosperity came through cooperation, not isolation. And this is where Nabal's path was destined to collide with David's. You see, David and his 600 men weren't just wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. They had essentially become a private security force, protecting the shepherds and flocks of various landowners from bandits, raiders, and wild animals. It was a dangerous job, but it was necessary work, and it created obligations of mutual support that were taken very seriously in ancient Near Eastern society. David's men had been providing exactly this kind of protection to Nabal's shepherds. For weeks, maybe months, they had served as guardians for Nabal's vast flocks, ensuring that his shepherds could do their work without fear of attack. This wasn't charity. This was business. And when the time came for sheep shearing season, when Nabal would be celebrating his annual profits, and when abundance would make generosity easy, David sent a polite request for compensation. But here's where everything went wrong. When David's men approached Nabal with what should have been a routine request for provisions, they encountered something they weren't prepared for: absolute contempt. Nabal didn't just refuse their request. He insulted them. He questioned David's legitimacy. He dismissed him as just another runaway servant, saying, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?" Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. "Why should I take my bread and water, and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to men coming from who knows where?" This response wasn't just ungrateful. It was deliberately insulting and demonstrated a complete lack of understanding of both social obligations and political realities. Nabal's dismissive attitude toward David revealed his ignorance of David's anointing as Israel's future king. But more importantly, it showed his callous disregard for basic human decency and the established customs that governed wilderness survival. What Nabal didn't realize was that his response had just signed a death warrant for every male in his household. Because when David heard about this rejection, something inside him snapped. This man who had recently shown mercy to King Saul, who had demonstrated restraint and godly character time and again, was suddenly consumed with rage. He ordered 400 of his men to strap on their swords and prepare for battle. His plan was simple and brutal: kill every male associated with Nabal's household. Think about this moment. David, the man after God's own heart, the future king of Israel, the one who would write many of the psalms we still sing today, was about to commit what could only be described as a massacre. His life of exile had filled him with anger, and that anger was now driving him toward an act of vengeance that would have stained his hands with innocent blood and potentially disqualified him from the throne of Israel. But God had positioned someone to stand in the gap, someone whose wisdom would prove greater than David's rage, whose courage would prove stronger than her fear, and whose faith would prove deeper than the crisis that threatened to destroy everything. Her name was Abigail, and she was Nabal's wife. Now everything about Abigail was the opposite of her husband. Where he was foolish, she was intelligent. Where he was cruel, she was kind. Where he was selfish, she was generous. The Bible describes her as both intelligent and beautiful, a combination that was rare and noteworthy in biblical literature. Her very name meant "my father's joy" or "source of joy," and it proved to be remarkably prophetic. But here's what makes her story so compelling. She was trapped in a marriage that was destroying her. During Abigail's time, young women had no choice in selecting their life partners. This arranged marriage to a wealthy but cruel man would have been seen as advantageous by her family from an economic standpoint, but it condemned her to daily misery and abuse. Every day, she had to navigate life with a man whose foolishness put everyone around him in danger. Yet somehow, in this impossible situation, Abigail had not become bitter. She had not given up. She had not lost her faith or her wisdom or her capacity for decisive action. Instead, she had cultivated relationships of trust throughout the household. The servants respected her. They came to her when problems arose. They trusted her judgment more than they feared her husband's wrath. And this is exactly what happened when one of Nabal's servants realized that his master's insult to David was about to bring disaster on the entire household. This servant didn't try to reason with Nabal. He didn't attempt to change his master's mind. He knew that would be futile. Instead, he ran directly to Abigail, because he understood that she possessed both the intelligence to grasp the seriousness of the situation and the courage to take decisive action, even if it meant going against her husband's wishes. What happened next would change everything. When that servant told Abigail what her husband had done, when he explained that David and 400 armed men were on their way to destroy the household, she didn't panic. She didn't despair. She didn't waste time trying to convince her stubborn husband to change his mind. Instead, she immediately began to formulate a plan that would require every ounce of her wisdom, courage, and faith. Because Abigail understood something that neither her husband nor David seemed to grasp in that moment. This crisis wasn't just about provisions or insults or wounded pride. This was about the destiny of Israel's future king. This was about whether the man after God's own heart would remain worthy of that title. This was about whether God's plan for his chosen people would move forward or be derailed by human anger and foolishness. And so, without hesitation and without telling her husband, Abigail began to organize what could only be described as a desperate rescue mission. But this wasn't just about saving her household from David's wrath. This was about saving David from himself. Because sometimes, the greatest heroism isn't about fighting the enemy. Sometimes it's about preventing the hero from becoming the villain. What Abigail was about to do would require her to risk everything: her safety, her marriage, her reputation, and quite possibly her life. She would have to move quickly, think strategically, and speak with a wisdom that could only come from God himself. She would have to intercept an army of angry, battle-hardened men led by a furious commander who had already made up his mind to kill. But she also understood something else. She wasn't just Nabal's wife trapped in an impossible situation. She was a woman called by God for such a time as this. She was positioned by divine providence to stand at one of the most crucial crossroads in Israel's history. And she was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely people become the instruments through which God accomplishes his greatest purposes. The question wasn't whether she had the courage to act. The question was whether her wisdom would be enough to change the mind of a man who had already unsheathed his sword for vengeance. The question was whether her faith would prove stronger than David's fury. The question was whether one woman's desperate mission could prevent a massacre and preserve the destiny of Israel's greatest king. What happened next would reveal not just the depth of Abigail's character, but the power of godly wisdom to triumph over human anger, the ability of humble faith to redirect the course of history, and the way that God uses ordinary people in extraordinary moments to accomplish his eternal purposes. The logistics of what Abigail was attempting were staggering. She needed to prepare enough food to feed 600 hungry, angry men. She needed to organize her household staff for immediate action without alerting her husband. She needed to calculate the timing perfectly so that she could intercept David's army before they reached her home. And she needed to do all of this while knowing that if Nabal discovered her actions, the consequences could be devastating. But Abigail moved with the precision of a military commander and the wisdom of a seasoned diplomat. She quickly assembled a feast that would have made kings envious: 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, 5 measures of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. This wasn't just food. This was a statement. This was exactly what David had originally requested from Nabal, but multiplied and presented with the respect and generosity that should have been offered from the beginning. Think about the courage this required. Abigail was essentially committing what her husband would consider theft of his property. She was taking initiative that could be seen as undermining his authority as head of the household. She was risking her marriage, her security, and quite possibly her life. But she understood that sometimes obedience to a higher authority requires disobedience to a lower one. Sometimes faithfulness to God's purposes means taking risks that seem impossible to justify. She loaded all these provisions onto donkeys and then made a decision that reveals the full extent of her strategic thinking. She sent her servants ahead with the supplies while she followed behind. This wasn't cowardice. This was tactical brilliance. If David's men encountered the provisions first, it would immediately begin to diffuse their anger and demonstrate good faith. It would give David time to see the generosity of the gift before he saw the person offering it. But there was something else happening here that goes beyond mere human wisdom and courage. As Abigail rode through the wilderness toward what could have been her death, she was being prepared for an encounter that would require not just diplomatic skill, but prophetic insight. She was about to meet the future king of Israel at one of the most crucial moments of his life, and she needed to speak with a voice that carried the authority of heaven itself. Meanwhile, David was approaching with 400 armed men, their swords drawn, their minds focused on vengeance. He had worked himself into a righteous fury, convincing himself that Nabal's insult demanded blood payment. He was thinking like a warrior, not like a king. He was acting out of wounded pride, not godly wisdom. And he was about to make a decision that would have haunted him for the rest of his life. This is where we see one of the most profound truths about leadership and character. The greatest leaders are not those who never face moments of moral crisis, but those who are rescued from their worst impulses by divine intervention and godly counsel. David's greatness wasn't diminished by his anger in this moment. His greatness was revealed in his ability to receive correction when it came. But first, that correction had to reach him. And it was coming in the form of a woman riding a donkey through the wilderness, carrying not just provisions for his men, but a message that would redirect the entire course of his life. When Abigail finally encountered David and his army, the scene was both terrifying and magnificent. Picture it: 600 battle-hardened men, weapons drawn, faces set for war, led by a commander whose reputation for both mercy and violence was already legendary throughout Israel. And approaching them, alone except for her servants, was a woman whose only weapons were her wisdom, her courage, and her faith in the God who had positioned her for this moment. What happened next defies every expectation of how such encounters typically end. Instead of cowering or pleading or trying to bargain for her life, Abigail immediately took control of the situation through an act of such profound humility and respect that it stopped David in his tracks. She dismounted from her donkey and fell on her face before him, bowing to the ground in the deepest possible expression of honor and submission. But this wasn't weakness. This was strategic brilliance wrapped in genuine respect. With this single gesture, she accomplished several things simultaneously. She demonstrated that she recognized David's authority and legitimacy as Israel's anointed king. She showed that she understood the seriousness of the offense her husband had committed. She diffused the immediate threat of violence through her vulnerability. And she created space for conversation rather than combat. Then she began to speak, and what came out of her mouth was nothing less than a masterpiece of diplomatic negotiation and prophetic declaration. Every word was carefully chosen. Every phrase was strategically placed. Every sentence built toward a conclusion that would not just prevent bloodshed but actually strengthen David's character and destiny. "Upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be," she began, immediately taking responsibility for her husband's actions. This wasn't just noble self-sacrifice. This was brilliant psychology. She was giving David someone to blame who was already demonstrating humility and respect, rather than forcing him to continue focusing his anger on the absent Nabal, who had shown only contempt and defiance. She addressed David as "my Lord" 14 times during her speech, while referring to herself as his handmaiden 6 times. This consistent use of respectful language throughout her appeal reinforced her recognition of his authority and destiny as king. But she wasn't just flattering him. She was helping him remember who he was called to be, not just who he was feeling like in that moment of rage. But here's where Abigail's appeal transcended mere diplomacy and entered the realm of prophetic ministry. She began to speak not just about the immediate crisis, but about David's ultimate destiny. She reminded him that the Lord had kept him from bloodshed and from taking vengeance with his own hand. She prophesied that God would certainly make him a lasting dynasty. She declared that his life was bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord his God, while his enemies would be hurled away as from the pocket of a sling. Think about the spiritual insight required for these words. Abigail was seeing beyond the immediate crisis to David's ultimate calling as Israel's king. She was reminding him of promises that had been made to him, victories that had been won for him, and a destiny that was still unfolding. She was speaking as a prophet, not just as a diplomat, calling him back to his true identity as a man after God's own heart. But perhaps most powerfully, she helped him see the long-term consequences of the action he was about to take. She urged him not to have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed. She painted a picture of his future self looking back on this moment with either gratitude for restraint or regret for vengeance. She was essentially saying, "The king you're going to become will thank the warrior you are today for making the right choice." This is the kind of wisdom that changes history. This is the kind of courage that preserves destinies. This is the kind of faith that sees beyond immediate circumstances to eternal purposes. And it was flowing from the lips of a woman who had every reason to be bitter about her circumstances, but had instead allowed those circumstances to refine her into an instrument of divine intervention. As Abigail spoke, something remarkable was happening to David. The rage that had consumed him was beginning to drain away, replaced by recognition and gratitude. He was remembering who he was, who he served, and what he was called to become. He was seeing his anger for what it really was, not righteous indignation, but dangerous pride that could have destroyed everything God had planned for him. The future king of Israel was being saved from his worst impulses by the wisdom of a woman whose own future was about to be transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. Because what started as a desperate mission to prevent a massacre was about to become the beginning of a love story that would echo through the corridors of Israel's history. David's response to Abigail's appeal revealed not just his capacity for wisdom, but the depth of his character as a man truly after God's own heart. As her words washed over him, as the truth of what she was saying penetrated through his anger and pride, something extraordinary happened. The sword that had been drawn for vengeance was slowly lowered. The fury that had driven him across the wilderness began to transform into gratitude. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me," David declared. Think about the humility required for those words. Here was a man who commanded 600 warriors, who had been anointed as Israel's future king, who had defeated giants and armies, acknowledging that God had sent a woman to save him from his own worst impulses. This wasn't weakness. This was the kind of strength that only comes from genuine spiritual maturity. But David's response went even deeper than gratitude. He blessed Abigail's good judgment and thanked her for keeping him from bloodshed and from avenging himself with his own hands. He understood exactly what had just happened. This wasn't just about preventing a massacre. This was about preserving his destiny as a righteous king. This was about maintaining his character as someone worthy of God's calling. "If you had not come quickly to meet me," David continued, "not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." The honesty in this admission is staggering. David wasn't trying to minimize his intentions or make excuses for his anger. He was acknowledging the full extent of what his rage had been driving him toward, and he was expressing genuine gratitude for being rescued from that path. This interaction between David and Abigail provides us with one of the most powerful examples in all of Scripture of how godly wisdom can triumph over human anger. How divine intervention often comes through ordinary people willing to act with extraordinary courage, and how the greatest leaders are those humble enough to receive correction when it comes from unexpected sources. But what happened next reveals something even more profound about God's justice and timing. As Abigail made her way back home, as David and his men turned away from vengeance and toward mercy, as crisis transformed into resolution, another drama was beginning to unfold back at Nabal's house. You see, while his wife was risking everything to save his life, while she was demonstrating wisdom and courage that would be remembered for thousands of years, Nabal was throwing himself a party. The Bible tells us he was holding a banquet in his house like the feast of a king, celebrating his wealth while completely oblivious to how close he had come to losing everything. Picture this scene. Abigail returns home after one of the most significant diplomatic missions in Israel's history, having just prevented a massacre and potentially saved the destiny of the future king, only to find her husband drunk and celebrating himself. The contrast couldn't be more stark. While she had been displaying the kind of wisdom and courage that changes history, he had been indulging in the kind of pride and excess that destroys it. Abigail, demonstrating wisdom even in this moment, waited until morning to tell Nabal what had happened. She understood that trying to reason with a drunk fool would be futile and potentially dangerous. So she waited until he was sober, until he could fully comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired, before revealing the truth. When morning came and Nabal's wine had worn off, Abigail told him everything. She explained how David's men had come seeking provisions. She described her husband's insulting response. She revealed how David had set out with 400 armed men to destroy every male in their household. And she told him how she had intercepted David with gifts and diplomacy, saving not just the household but Nabal himself from certain death. The Bible records what happened next with chilling precision. His heart failed him and he became like a stone. For 10 days, Nabal lingered in this condition, neither fully alive nor completely dead, as if suspended between the consequences of his foolishness and the mercy that had temporarily spared him. And then, Scripture tells us, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't natural causes. This was divine justice executed with perfect timing. The same God who had sent Abigail to prevent David from taking vengeance had reserved judgment for himself. The fool who had insulted God's anointed, who had shown contempt for basic human decency, who had endangered everyone around him through his pride and selfishness, now faced the ultimate consequence of his choices. But here's what makes this divine justice so remarkable. It came after mercy had been extended, after lives had been spared, after the innocent had been protected. God's judgment on Nabal didn't come in the heat of anger or through human vengeance. It came as the final resolution to a situation where divine mercy and human wisdom had already accomplished their work. For Abigail, Nabal's death represented liberation in ways she could never have imagined. After years of living with a man whose foolishness constantly threatened everyone around him, after enduring the daily reality of being married to someone who embodied everything contrary to godly character, she was finally free. But her freedom came not through her own scheming or manipulation, but through divine intervention and perfect timing. Word of Nabal's death traveled quickly through the region, and when it reached David, his response revealed both his spiritual maturity and his recognition of Abigail's extraordinary character. Rather than simply feeling satisfied that his enemy had been dealt with, David saw in these events the hand of God working to bring justice while preserving mercy. "Praise be to the Lord," David declared when he heard the news, "who has upheld my cause against Nabal's insults and has kept his servant from doing wrong. The Lord has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." But David's thoughts quickly turned from Nabal's judgment to Abigail's future. This woman who had demonstrated such remarkable wisdom, courage, and faith, who had saved him from moral failure and preserved his destiny as king, was now free from the marriage that had trapped her with a fool. And David, recognizing both her character and God's providence in their meeting, made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He sent messengers to Abigail with a proposal of marriage. Think about what this meant. David was essentially saying that he had been so impressed by her wisdom, so grateful for her intervention, so convinced of her character, that he wanted her to become not just his wife, but his partner in the great work God had called him to accomplish. This wasn't just a romantic gesture, though there was certainly romance in it. This was a strategic alliance based on mutual respect and shared values. David had seen Abigail at her finest moment, when everything was on the line, when courage and wisdom were the only things standing between disaster and deliverance. He had witnessed her faith in action, her diplomacy under pressure, her willingness to risk everything for what was right. And he wanted that kind of wisdom and strength beside him as he moved toward the throne of Israel. For Abigail, David's proposal represented vindication in the most remarkable way possible. The woman who had been trapped in a marriage to a fool was now being invited to become the wife of Israel's future king. The wisdom that had been wasted on Nabal would now be valued and utilized in service to God's chosen leader. The courage that had been required just to survive her first marriage would now be channeled into helping shape the future of God's people. Her response to David's proposal reveals the same humility and wisdom that had characterized her diplomatic mission. She immediately accepted, but not with pride or self-congratulation. Instead, she responded with the same servant-hearted attitude that had made her intervention so effective. She saw herself as David's handmaiden, ready to serve not just him but the purposes of God through their partnership. The transformation in Abigail's circumstances was so dramatic it almost defies comprehension. In the space of a few weeks, she had gone from being the abused wife of a wealthy fool to becoming the honored wife of God's anointed king. She had moved from a household where her wisdom was ignored and her courage was required just for survival to a position where both would be valued and utilized in service to the highest calling imaginable. But this dramatic reversal wasn't just about personal vindication or reward. It was about God's sovereign ability to take the most difficult circumstances and use them to prepare people for purposes they never could have imagined. Every day of suffering with Nabal had been developing in Abigail the patience, wisdom, and strength of character she would need as David's wife and queen. Every moment of navigating life with a fool had been preparing her to counsel a future king. Her story reminds us that God's preparation often comes disguised as problems, that His promotion frequently follows periods of testing, and that His purposes are accomplished through people who remain faithful even when their faithfulness seems to go unnoticed and unrewarded. Abigail's marriage to David also marked a crucial turning point in his own journey toward the throne. By bringing her into his household, he wasn't just gaining a wife. He was gaining a counselor whose wisdom had already proven capable of saving him from serious moral failure. He was adding to his inner circle someone who understood both the weight of leadership and the importance of remaining faithful to God's character and calling. As we consider the broader implications of Abigail's story, we begin to see how her intervention shaped not just that one moment of crisis, but David's entire approach to leadership and justice. The man who would become Israel's greatest king had learned a crucial lesson about the value of godly counsel, the importance of restraint, and the way that divine wisdom often comes through unexpected sources. But perhaps most importantly, Abigail's story demonstrates how God positions people strategically throughout history to accomplish His purposes at exactly the right moments. She wasn't accidentally in the right place at the right time. She was divinely placed, prepared through hardship, and equipped with the exact combination of wisdom, courage, and faith needed for a moment that would echo through eternity. Her legacy extends far beyond her personal triumph, or even her influence on David. She represents the power of faithful endurance, the value of godly wisdom, and the way that God uses ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances to accomplish His eternal purposes. She shows us that no situation is too difficult for God to use, no person too insignificant for Him to call, and no moment too small to change the course of history. The marriage of David and Abigail represents far more than a romantic conclusion to an already remarkable story. It reveals something profound about how God orchestrates events across time to accomplish purposes that stretch far beyond what any individual can see or understand. When Abigail became David's wife, she wasn't just escaping a difficult situation or receiving a reward for her faithfulness. She was stepping into a role that would influence the very heart of Israel's greatest king during the most formative period of his reign. Think about what this meant for David's development as a leader. Here was a man who had just been saved from committing an act that could have disqualified him from the throne. He had come face to face with his own capacity for destructive anger, and he had been rescued by the wisdom of someone he had never met before. This experience didn't just change his immediate actions. It transformed his understanding of leadership itself. From Abigail, David learned that the greatest strength often comes through restraint, that true wisdom frequently speaks through unexpected voices, and that divine intervention doesn't always look like miraculous signs and wonders. Sometimes it looks like a woman on a donkey carrying provisions and speaking truth with such clarity that it cuts through rage and reaches the heart. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Abigail's influence on David didn't end with their marriage. As his wife and counselor, she continued to shape his character and his approach to kingship. The Psalms David would later write filled with meditations on justice, mercy, and the importance of seeking godly counsel, bear the marks of lessons learned not just in caves and battlefields, but in conversations with a woman whose wisdom had already proven its worth in the most critical circumstances. Consider how this dynamic played out in David's later reign. When he became king, he was known not just for his military prowess, but for his pursuit of justice, his willingness to listen to counsel, and his understanding that true leadership required both strength and restraint. These weren't qualities he was born with. They were characteristics developed through experiences like his encounter with Abigail, refined through relationships with people who valued wisdom over winning and character over conquest. The ripple effects of Abigail's intervention extend even further when we consider the broader scope of biblical history. David's character as a king, shaped in part by his relationship with Abigail, directly influenced the stability and prosperity of Israel during its golden age. The wisdom she had demonstrated in preventing one act of vengeance contributed to a reign marked by justice and mercy rather than arbitrary violence and personal vendetta. But perhaps most significantly, Abigail's story challenges every assumption about how God accomplishes his purposes in the world. She wasn't a prophet like Samuel, a priest like Eli, or a warrior like Jonathan. She was a woman trapped in a difficult marriage who chose to respond to crisis with wisdom rather than despair, with courage rather than resignation, with faith rather than bitterness. Her story demolishes the lie that circumstances determine destiny. Despite being married to a fool, despite living in a harsh and dangerous time, despite having every reason to become cynical about justice and mercy, Abigail maintained a heart that was tender toward God and wise in understanding his ways. She proves that faithfulness in small things prepares us for significant moments, that character developed in private becomes strength displayed in public, and that God's preparation often comes disguised as problems we never wanted to face. This is why her story matters so much for us today. How many people are living in circumstances that feel impossible? How many are dealing with difficult relationships, unfair situations, or problems that seem to have no solution? How many are tempted to believe that because their current situation is hard, their future is hopeless? Abigail's story speaks directly to these struggles. It reminds us that God sees every situation, that he positions people strategically for moments they don't even know are coming, and that faithfulness in the midst of difficulty is actually preparation for purposes beyond our imagination. But her story also challenges us to examine our own responses to crisis and conflict. When faced with impossible situations, do we respond with wisdom or emotion? When dealing with difficult people, do we seek solutions or just vent our frustration? When witnessing injustice, do we trust God's timing or take matters into our own hands? Abigail's example shows us that the most powerful responses to crisis often involve humility rather than pride, service rather than self-protection, and faith in God's justice rather than demands for immediate vindication. Her willingness to take responsibility for her husband's actions, to risk her safety for others' benefit, and to speak truth with grace rather than condemnation provides a blueprint for navigating conflict that transcends cultural boundaries and historical periods. The diplomatic skills she demonstrated in her encounter with David offer timeless lessons in communication and conflict resolution. She showed respect without compromising truth, took responsibility without accepting blame for others' character flaws, and appealed to David's highest nature rather than responding to his lowest impulses. These aren't just ancient techniques for ancient problems. They're principles that work in marriage conflicts, workplace tensions, family disputes, and community disagreements. They remind us that the goal of confrontation isn't to win arguments, but to find solutions. That the purpose of difficult conversations isn't to prove our point, but to preserve relationships and accomplish good purposes. Abigail's story also reveals something crucial about the nature of biblical heroism. Unlike the dramatic victories of warriors or the miraculous interventions of prophets, her heroism was quiet, relational, and focused on preventing harm rather than achieving glory. She didn't slay giants or part seas. She simply saw a crisis, understood what was at stake, and acted with wisdom and courage to prevent disaster. This kind of heroism is available to every person in every generation. It doesn't require special calling, supernatural gifts, or extraordinary circumstances. It simply requires the willingness to act wisely when wisdom is needed, to speak truthfully when truth is required, and to trust God's purposes even when the outcome is uncertain. As we conclude this remarkable story, we're left with questions that demand personal reflection. What situations in your life are calling for Abigail-like wisdom and courage? Where might God be positioning you to prevent disaster or preserve someone's destiny? What difficult circumstances might actually be preparing you for purposes you can't yet see? Perhaps most importantly, are you developing the kind of character that can be trusted with significant moments when they arrive? Are you cultivating wisdom in the small decisions that will prepare you for the large ones? Are you maintaining faithfulness in private that will enable you to demonstrate courage in public? Abigail's legacy isn't just about one woman's extraordinary moment of intervention. It's about the kind of person God uses to accomplish His purposes in every generation. It's about ordinary people who choose to respond to extraordinary circumstances with wisdom, faith, and courage. Her story reminds us that heroes aren't always the people who get the most attention or receive the most recognition. Sometimes they're the people who prevent disasters rather than create victories, who preserve destinies rather than build empires, who speak wisdom in moments of crisis rather than deliver speeches in times of celebration. But whether recognized or overlooked, whether celebrated or forgotten, their influence echoes through history in ways they never could have imagined. Just as Abigail's intervention shaped David's character and influenced Israel's future, our faithfulness in difficult moments creates ripple effects that extend far beyond what we can see or understand. This is the shocking role of Abigail, not just David's unsung heroine, but a timeless example of how God uses unexpected people in crucial moments to accomplish eternal purposes. Her story isn't just ancient history. It's a living reminder that in a world full of conflict and crisis, wisdom and courage can still change everything. So what does this mean for you right now, in your circumstances, in your relationships, in the moments when everything seems to be falling apart? What does it mean when you're facing your own navel, when you're dealing with people whose foolishness seems determined to destroy everything around them? Here's the truth that Abigail's story burns into our hearts. You don't have to wait for perfect circumstances to demonstrate extraordinary character. You don't need ideal situations to display divine wisdom. You don't require easy relationships to show the kind of courage that changes destinies. Because here's what most people miss about this story. They focus on the dramatic encounter between Abigail and David, on the moment of crisis and intervention. But the real power of her story lies in what happened before that moment. It lies in the years of faithful endurance, the daily choices to remain wise in the face of foolishness, the decision to cultivate godly character even when no one was watching. Every day that Abigail chose patience over bitterness was preparing her for the moment when patience would save a kingdom. Every time she responded with wisdom to her husband's foolishness, she was developing the diplomatic skills that would prevent a massacre. Every decision to trust God's timing rather than take matters into her own hands was building the faith that would speak prophetically to Israel's future king. This is how God works. This is how He prepares people for moments that will echo through eternity. Not through comfortable circumstances or easy relationships, but through the grinding, daily choice to remain faithful when faithfulness seems pointless, to stay wise when wisdom appears wasted, to keep trusting when trust feels foolish. And here's what's remarkable about divine timing. God doesn't waste any of it. Not the years of difficulty, not the moments of despair, not the seasons when it feels like your wisdom is falling on deaf ears and your character is going unnoticed. All of it is preparation. All of it is positioning. All of it is building toward purposes you can't yet see. But there's something else in Abigail's story that we absolutely cannot miss. Her intervention didn't just save David from committing a terrible act. It saved him from becoming someone he was never meant to be. It preserved not just his actions but his identity, not just his reputation but his destiny. This is what godly influence looks like in its purest form. It's not about controlling people or manipulating outcomes. It's about calling people back to who they really are, reminding them of who they're called to become, helping them see beyond their immediate emotions to their eternal purposes. When Abigail spoke to David, she didn't lecture him about his anger or shame him for his intentions. She reminded him of his anointing, his calling, his future. She helped him see himself not as he was in that moment of rage, but as God intended him to be as king. She spoke to his destiny, not his dysfunction. This is the kind of influence that transforms relationships, families, communities, and nations. It's the influence that sees potential rather than problems, that speaks to calling rather than failure, that believes in redemption rather than giving up on people. And perhaps this is where Abigail's story speaks most powerfully to our modern world. In a culture obsessed with instant gratification and immediate results, her story reminds us that the most significant influence often happens slowly, quietly, through faithful endurance and wise responses to difficult circumstances. In a world that celebrates the loud and dramatic, she shows us that sometimes the most powerful interventions happen through humility, service, and the willingness to take responsibility for solutions rather than just complaining about problems. In a time when people are quick to write off difficult relationships and impossible situations, her example demonstrates that God specializes in using exactly those circumstances to prepare people for purposes beyond their wildest dreams. So as we close this remarkable story, let me ask you directly, what would happen if you began to see your current difficulties not as obstacles to overcome, but as preparation for purposes you can't yet imagine? What would change if you started responding to the difficult people in your life, not with frustration, but with the kind of wisdom and patience that could redirect their destinies? What if the very situations that are testing you right now are actually positioning you for moments of influence that will echo through generations? What if your faithfulness in the small, unseen choices is preparing you to be the person someone needs you to be in their moment of crisis? Because here's the final truth that Abigail's story teaches us. God is always writing a larger story than the one we can see. He's always preparing people for purposes that stretch beyond their immediate circumstances. He's always positioning ordinary individuals to become extraordinary instruments of His grace at exactly the right moment. The question isn't whether God can use your situation. The question is whether you'll remain faithful in that situation long enough for His purposes to unfold. The question isn't whether you have what it takes to make a difference. The question is whether you'll trust Him to develop in you what you need when you need it. Abigail didn't know she was being prepared to save a king. She just knew she needed to remain faithful to God's character, regardless of her circumstances. She didn't know her wisdom would prevent a massacre. She just knew she needed to respond to crisis with faith rather than fear. And that's exactly what God is asking of you today. Not that you figure out His entire plan or understand all His purposes. Just that you remain faithful where you are, respond wisely to what you're facing, and trust Him to use your obedience in ways that will amaze you. The shocking role of Abigail wasn't just about one dramatic intervention. It was about a lifetime of preparation that culminated in a moment that changed history. And your shocking role in God's story isn't about waiting for one big moment. It's about the daily faithful choices that are preparing you for purposes you've never imagined. So what's your next step? What situation in your life needs Abigail's kind of wisdom? What relationship requires her type of courage? What crisis is calling for her brand of faith? Don't wait for perfect circumstances to start living with extraordinary character. Don't postpone wisdom until the stakes feel high enough. Don't delay faithfulness until the purposes become clear. Start now. Start where you are. Start with what you have. Because somewhere, in ways you can't see, God is preparing you for your own moment to stand in the gap, to speak wisdom into chaos, to prevent disaster through divine intervention. The world needs more Abigails. It needs more people who choose wisdom over emotion, patience over revenge, faith over fear. It needs more individuals who understand that the greatest heroism often happens not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, not through dramatic gestures, but through faithful endurance. Will you be one of them? Will you let your circumstances prepare you rather than define you? Will you trust God's timing even when His purposes remain hidden? Because if you will, then like Abigail, you might just discover that your greatest trials were actually your greatest preparation, that your most difficult relationships were your most valuable training, and that your moment of influence was worth every day of patient endurance that led to it. This is the shocking role of Abigail, and it could be your shocking role too.